About a month ago, my friend Tomer, aka Animals and Synthesizers, invited me to play a short live set at his album launch party. I had never performed music from this channel live, so it was a good opportunity to get out of the comfort zone of a studio and put a live set together. Not to mention play with enough bass to make the LEDs shake. The biggest challenge I had was choosing this setup. Any given track that I had made over the years on the channel was created using an entirely different collection of gear. For example, this track was originally made on the Analog Rhythm Mark II. Another track I wanted to play was made on a fairly sizable modular setup. And then others with totally different synths. I needed to find a way to bring it all together in as minimalist set as possible. I wanted to add more layers to each track to evolve them beyond the relatively short jams in the videos and to be able to play and improvise with them live. Quite a few musical brains were considered for the setup: a Deluge, Analog Rhythm Mark II, Octatrack, MPC-1, Force, Maschine, and a Push 2 with Ableton Live. I even toyed with the idea of Sampletrek as a super portable option. I wanted to build a modular setup that could grow or not as needed. Modular not necessarily as in Eurorack, but rather that I'd be able to perform the entire set with a single brain and then have the option to add gear to replace internal sounds to expand the hands-on controls and sound palette performance later on. The fact that I wanted to be able to fall back on one device meant that I couldn't use the Octatrack or Rhythm Mark II because they didn't have enough polyphony on their own. I also wanted to play onboard synths and import loops if needed and time stretch them easily, which meant Sampletrek was also not an option. Deluge was seriously considered. There are a few reasons why it wasn't a good fit for me. First, I wanted to have multiple songs in a single project. Deluge is very much color-based as opposed to letting you name scenes. So managing multiple songs in one project seemed a bit too much of a mental overload. Also, I have a preference for as many knobs as possible to control macros and mix in real time, and I didn't want to have to rely on pairing a MIDI controller for that. Another reason why Deluge wasn't a good fit was because I wanted to have the option to edit the project on a computer because I was traveling the week before the show, but then perform the live set without a computer. I'm not religiously against using a computer or DAW in a live set, by the way, but my laptop is a fully spec'd M1 Max MacBook Pro and I didn't want to risk it getting destroyed in a beer-related accident. The only reason I have such a powerful Mac is for editing videos, so in the future, if I thought I wanted to do many shows, I would definitely consider getting a less expensive computer and bringing that on stage. But for now, that meant that Push 2 was also out of consideration. So we're left with MPC, Force, and Maschine Plus. Now, if I was making this video a couple of years ago, Maschine Plus would have been a clear winner for me, but since then Akai has been on a roll of improving both Force and MPC, and in particular substantially improving and increasing the number of plug-in instruments and effects, including a mellotron and pianos, which I wanted to include in this live set. One thing that was important for me when performing live was not to load projects mid-performance, but rather have all the songs live in scenes, as they're called here, or sequences in MPC lingo, all in a single project. Now, all three platforms can pull this off, but Akai has a ceiling of 8 plugins running at once. I wanted to have the freedom to expand the set as much as I wanted, so as I added more songs to a single project, I'd hit an 8 plugin wall very quickly. Now you could work around this limitation with MPCs or Force by multi-sampling instruments, which is what I did, by the way, in the case of the missing mellotron on Maschine Plus. I multi-sampled Arturia's Mellotron V. Now that's relatively easy to do with an instrument that's based on tape loops. This is the Mellotron multi-sample or auto-sample. But if you want to be able to control a synth in real time with cutoff controls, oscillator intervals, and any other timbral goodies only synths can offer, that's a little bit harder to do with a multi-sample, obviously. So that basically sealed the deal for choosing Maschine Plus, the fact that I needed to have more than 8 plugins for a multi-song live set all in one project. By the way, another way to overcome the MPC limit of 8 plugins is to use external synths, and at some point when adding songs, I might have hit a wall with the Maschine Plus's CPU, but that wasn't the case in this project. Beside that, there are a few other conveniences in Maschine that don't exist in MPC, at least not yet, which are the ability to reuse the same pattern in multiple scenes as opposed to MPC, where you need to copy-paste recurring patterns and do that again if you edit them, as well as the very useful locks function, which I'll talk about in a bit. But those weren't deal makers, and it doesn't mean that everything went smoothly with Maschine Plus. It's not perfect. Stick around for the pros and cons, and I'll summarize the issues there. But first, let's talk a bit about the setup. The setup started out just with Maschine Plus. Like I mentioned, I wanted to program everything here and be able to perform just with this if I had to. The first natural add-on was Moog's Sirin. It sounds great. It doesn't take up much space and has plenty of meaningful hands-on controls. I could easily peel off lead or bass rolls to it as needed by lowering the level or deleting the instrument in Maschine Plus and just sending MIDI out instead. Sirin is then fed into H90. Maschine has plenty of effects, but some of the effects in H90 are next level, and that also gives me additional hands-on controls with 4 additional knobs to control different parameters of the effects on the H90. In terms of MIDI, Sirin doesn't have a MIDI through, so MIDI is first sent to H90 to keep the effects in sync with Machine's clock, and then MIDI through is sent to sequence Sirin. Audio is routed from Sirin to H90 and then back into Maschine through the audio inputs. I didn't want to waste H90 on a regular delay or reverb since it can do so much more, and Maschine can handle those quite well. So even if I turn H90 off, I've got Sirin going into one group, and this has a delay on top, which I can control the mix, of course. Then that's being sent into Raum over here as a send as well for reverb. Then I can add whatever I want in here on top of that. Raum, by the way, acts as a send for all the other tracks, so I only have one instance of reverb in the entire project for all the songs. The final 2 pieces of hardware in the setup were a Launchpad and QuNexus keyboard, both powered by Maschine Plus's USB ports during the show. Right now they're plugged into my computer and I'm using Maschine Plus in controller mode for reasons I'll talk about in the cons section in a bit. QuNexus lets me play the active track and is small and portable. I typically prefer a bigger keyboard like the Keystep or M32, but for the songs I had in this setlist, QuNexus was fine. I played pads with QuNexus and leads on Maschine Plus to keep the setup more compact. As far as the Launchpad goes, I used it as a scene launcher, so you can map it to launch scenes. So you can see that over here and over here. You can see it's mapped very similarly. It's not a must, but more of a convenience thing that lets me be on the mixer or macro screens, which always take you out of scene mode. So if I go to the mixer, you can only choose one of these pad modes. Same goes for the macro screen. If you're on the macro screen, you can't be in scene mode for the pads. And the way that I wanted to play, I wanted to be able to control levels on the mixer and swap chords, scenes in this case, at the same time, without having to go back and forth. If I didn't have a Launchpad, I could still swap scenes by holding scene, swapping a scene, then going back to the mixer, or putting scene in temporary mode, just going like this. It's just easier, I think, mentally to be able to swap scenes here and control the mixer here. A better but bigger alternative to the Launchpad would be a Maschine Jam, which is quite big, so I preferred the Launchpad to help me keep the setup small. Okay, let's dive in and look at the project structure. Theoretically, you can structure an entire song in a single group and then move between groups To swap songs, since each group can have up to 16 elements, you could easily mute elements, but a cleaner project structure would be to use groups for the different tracks or elements of a song and swap banks when you move from song to song. This meant I can always keep performance mixing on a group level as opposed to a sound level and toggling back and forth between the two. Diving in a bit deeper to the song level, songs in the project include a combination of samples and instruments I synthesized. Maschine Plus has a few built-in synths, a bass synth, polysynth, and then VSTs, which are Massive, Prism, FM8, and Monarch. I gravitated towards Massive because it's the one that I could customize the most to behave exactly the way that I wanted, and it has a very nice and broad selection of wavetables, modulation controls, and even effects. The disadvantage of using Massive or FM8 or the internal VSTs is that you don't have access to all of its parameters from the Maschine Plus itself, and it becomes a bit messy and hard to understand as you tab right and left through the many pages of parameters. So in order to program it, you need to be ready to open up a computer and use this interface, and then you can later transfer the project to the hardware, which had separate issues, which I'll talk about later. There are a few reasons I like Massive. First, the macros. So after you're done setting up whatever you want, you can point macros to different parameters and also set the mod depth for each macro. So for example, and you can see the macros here as well, I wanted to be able to tune the oscillators, in this case, a fifth in multiple directions. And note that a full turn of the knob goes the full extent of the mod depth or modulation that I wanted. And as you can see, I could name these any way I want. And I've got phase mod and scream control. So having things named exactly the way you want them is important in a live set. That way you don't need to remember what a knob does if it's on an external controller or if it isn't labeled directly. Let's look at maybe one more example. So for this song, I wanted to make sure that I got this bass just right. In the original song, this timbre was dialed up carefully on FrapTool's Fumana, which is a massive multi-filter module. Here I just paged through many of the wavetables until I found one that sounded right. And Massive also has a few built-in effects, so I dialed in a bit of drive here. In addition to distortion added later in the chain. And then I also use samples quite a bit in the project. So for example, this sound was sampled from the Rhythm Mark II. And if we go into this song, then this sound is the 4MS Ensemble Oscillator, which just sounds like nothing else, I think. Anyway, once the sounds were in place, it was time to set up a few macros. I'm not talking about macros from Massive, but rather overall macros for Maschine Plus. So for example, if I go into this sound, so on the plugin level, these are the macros I programmed in Massive, but I also wanted to control additional parameters in the delays and preferably all in one page. So the way you do that is you just map macros to different functions. You just hit Shift and set the macros. I mapped these on a group level, so you can see the three macros I mapped here. And then if I go into the plugins and go into this, you'll see I mapped the feedback and mix for both delays. And if we exit this and go to macros again on a group level, you see I have control over the three parameters that I grabbed from Massive: cutoff, oscillators, but also the delay mix and the delay feedback for the two delay plugins I have in this chain. I kept the macros on a group level, even though sometimes they only took parameters from a single sound because I didn't want to have to hop around between group and sound macros. And on a master level, I only had one macro, the delay mix for Sirin and H90. Then zooming back out to scenes, I used scenes mainly for chord changes, but also for different sections in a song if I wanted. So for example here, this is the intro, and I could say, control things with a mixer here. Always move ahead to the next section. And the outro later on. So either by song section, by chords, and for one song I just had everything in one single scene. And in this case, I just brought in sections of the song either with levels or using mutes, group mutes. For this roll, this tom roll, and snare. The next thing I relied on quite heavily in my set is locks. Locks is a very powerful feature and pretty unique to Maschine, I think. It lets you capture and save a snapshot of almost all the parameter values in a project. So the basic way locks work is you can get something going and then hit lock, take a snapshot, mess things up. And if you're unhappy with it, just hit lock again. And here I set a transition duration and things are back to the lock. Now, locks apply to quite a few parameters, mixer levels, even mutes for groups and for sounds. And this gives you an advantage. When you swap scenes, you don't necessarily change the sounds, you just change the patterns. Let's take a look at an example for this one scene song. So I'll get this going, add my bass, and maybe open up these a bit, add more delays, add my drums, even add the mellotron. And then within this one scene, if I wanted things to go back to a different lock state, I hit external locks. I've got a few saved lock states here. And this one will just morph everything to where these tracks are muted and these macros are set to these values. And this is a secondary state in the song, which is unlike the first state in the song, which is this one. Fortunately, you can't label these, by the way, which would have been nice, maybe in a future firmware update. So a really nice way to morph between multiple sets of parameter values and mutes. Unfortunately, locks don't control tempo, so you need to change that manually if it varies between songs. They also don't swap scenes, and they don't change the grid. There may be other things they don't change, but it certainly would have been nice if there was an option to control all of those. And the idea is that I can get to the init state of any of the songs by just pressing its corresponding pad, and then save additional states for songs if I want in pads that aren't taken up. And if you need, you've got up to 64 of these, so 4 banks of locks. Okay, so that's pretty much the setup. Let's take a look at some of the pros and cons of using Maschine Plus as the heart of a small or large live setup. On the pros side, I already mentioned most of those when I talked about why I picked Maschine Plus. I found it extremely useful that you can work on a project both on a computer and without one. This means you can get prep work done on the road or wherever you are, but leave the computer home and not have it as yet another thing you need to worry about when you actually go to perform a set. The locks are one of the most useful features I've ever seen on a Groovebox. The macros are easy to assign and use. And the fact that you've got a high-res screen and can label almost everything means that you don't need to stick tape to any gear. What I like about Maschine Plus is that it can do a very broad range of things, and then you can choose to complement it with synths or effects that take that to the next level. On the cons side, while I feel like there aren't many limits with Maschine Plus, it is starting to fall behind compared to Akai in terms of plugin options, especially if you like to design your own sounds, or say compared to a push-to with a computer. If you're fine with just playing presets and the internal sounds or the sounds you get with expansions, not that there's anything wrong with that, then you'll probably find something close enough to the sound you need. But if you like to tweak and design your own sounds to get them just right, say on Massive or FM8, you'll need to do that on a computer and transfer the patches over to Maschine Plus if you want to perform just with a Maschine Plus and not with a computer. This as opposed to Akai's MPC, which does let us edit all the synth parameters on the device itself. So if Akai ever break the 8 plugin limit on Force and MPC, they'd have a killer value proposition for multi-song live sets that don't necessarily need to rely on external synths. Also, Maschine is very light on generative features, no probabilities or chance like the MPCs, no MIDI effects like Hapax, Pyramid, or Polyant Play, and nothing like Spice or Dice with Arturia's recent sequencers. It does have the humanize and random functions, but they're relatively limited. I also encountered a few technical difficulties. If you want to transfer projects back and forth from a computer to Maschine Plus, in the current version of the firmware, you need to make sure you're using VST2s on a computer and not VST3s, otherwise the project won't transfer from the computer as is. Also, regardless, you need to transfer synth preset sounds you make separately one by one because they don't get saved with the project. There should be a save with sounds option, just like you can save projects with their samples today. Obviously, this has Wi-Fi. If projects would just sync automatically over the cloud, that would be amazing. Also, there's something that's very missing on Maschine Plus and MK3. There's no master level meter to see if you're close to clipping. There is one if you connect to a computer in the software, or if you connect Maschine Jam to this, but if not, make sure your projects leave a lot of headroom. Furthermore, there's a noticeable click when you hit stop and sometimes start that's amplified if you have your instruments sent to a delay or reverb. Right now I'm in controller mode. It doesn't happen in the software that I noticed. I did find a way around this, by the way. I created a lock that reduces all the levels to 0 and extends the reverb. Then I could hit stop and the click wouldn't happen. It's also a cool way to transition between songs, but it shouldn't have to be this way. There are also clicks when you're in standalone mode when you change the tempo if a project is playing. You can't hear it now, again, because I'm in controller mode, but that again would be nice if it didn't happen, obviously. One more thing, while overall I found that Maschine Plus was pretty stable as far as just leaving it on and performing with it, but there's a known issue where it can take a while to restart. So if you need to restart during a live show, don't, or prepare a few jokes to kill time, or hook a sequencer directly to a synth to improvise. Hopefully that issue gets addressed soon. I know that it's on Native Instruments' radar. So that's it for the why and how I performed this live setup. If you want to hear the entire live set performance start to finish, I'll put that up on Patreon. Overall, I'm quite pleased with Maschine Plus, but certainly any of the other brain options I discussed earlier could have been made to work as well. We're quite spoiled for choice in terms of what we have to work with. If you're interested in more insights, there are plenty more setup tips and ideas in my ever-expanding book available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, and don't forget to ring the YouTube bell below to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.